Ladies and gentlemen, this is William Keat of lawandalchemy.org and commonlawconstitution.org. Welcome. This is a video sort of coming about a week later after the whole business that we had about writing. Well, many of us were getting involved in writing letters to Brian Leveson after his invitation for evidence. So this is about a week later after that. I wrote one and I put it up, and I want to thank other people for diving in on that and writing some great letters. So I started to feel maybe that we're getting glimpses of action and people coming on board, which is fantastic. And I know that a handful of you have been doing that for a while, and it's I'm delighted that that's the case, and thank you. I'm not dismissing that. It's just the sheer lack of numbers, which is a bit concerning. So anyway, what is this about? This is about following up on that week, about writing to Brian Leveson about the Leveson review, and this is about further action, and also some more observations that I have made in the last week or so of things that have come about. And what I've come to realise, I kind of knew this, but I think I've sort of crystallised it, is the fact that the biggest misunderstanding, certainly in the mainstream world, but frighteningly that's spilling over into the freedom movement as well, I think, is the fact that there is an inability to understand legitimacy and authority. And so that's what I'm going to get into today, and I'm going to demonstrate by giving some examples of where I'm seeing this misunderstanding. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the sorts of action that we could actually very easily take. So first of all, I want to break down this issue to do with legitimacy and authority. So people are still not getting this on the whole, I would say, apart from a few of you experts that follow me quite regularly. Obviously you do. But in the main, I would say that most people are not understanding the nature of the rule of law in its authentic form. So, and not getting this, and what I'm about to clarify for you, not getting understanding this and getting this, means that you can't speak authoritatively. Okay, so it's ultimately resulting this misunderstanding in a lack of ability to argue the case. Yeah, and it stems from the ability to stress and express where the authority lies. Yeah, legitimacy of law within a rule of law generally lies not in its government. Right, that's the key. Yeah, if that were the case, then effectively what you're saying and you're accepting is that anything that government creates in the legislature is fundamentally valid and has authority and legitimacy. And we need to just test that theory, because many people know that isn't always the case. Yeah. So the most sort of high contrasting way, if you like, of testing that is, what if the government started writing outrageous legislation, morally outrageous legislation? So let's take an example, like all heads of schools must ensure that all male teacher employees are castrated to protect children. Okay, slightly bizarre, but let's say that was the case. Okay, so in other words, it's an offence to employ anyone who isn't castrated. I wasn't expecting that the head should make sure that that's the case personally. That's not what I was saying. I'm basically saying, let's pretend for a moment that the government passed a piece of legislation that said that it was an offence. Yeah, so would you go along with that? Yeah. So the question actually, in all seriousness, is where is your line? Yeah, and if that line exists, if it does exist, and therefore there is a point at which you would simply say, no, I'm sorry, I'm just absolutely not going along with that. That means that you would always have had the power to give or withdraw consent. Yeah, that demonstrates that it's there and that it's yours to exercise. Yeah, that's the point. Yeah. So would you go along with that if you were a public servant or you're involved in some kind of enforcement. Yeah, what if you were a police officer, let's say, and you had to arrest a headmaster for not going along with that legislation, let's say? Yeah, would you follow those orders to arrest that head teacher? Yeah, and it sort of brings up other questions in history, and quite recent history as well, worryingly. Like, would you assist in the whole processes and procedures of putting Jews on the trains to the concentration camps? Would you have been involved in that? So ultimately what this is would you follow these orders internally within government to make an arrest in that situation if someone was not complying with an outrageous piece of legislation? Yeah, so what this comes down to is order following, essentially. And if any of you are familiar with the Stanley Milgram experiments, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. This is all about compliance. And I think it was 1961. There's a very good film about Stanley Milgram, a dramatization of the whole story. You should see it. And actually, I'll find it out and I'll put the information in the description. It's very interesting. But briefly, what it was, it demonstrated conclusively that a surprisingly high percentage of people in our society, when consistently told to go along with immoral orders that results in hurting another human being, would indeed go along with it and perform those actions. Yeah, and that's really a frightening idea, frightening concept, and in a way that's what caused the most upset in the people who ended up involved in those experiments, because what it highlighted was the fact that most of them just went along with it. They didn't resist. I think there was only one in the dramatization who actually said, "I'm sorry, but I'm not going along with this." You should watch it. It's very interesting. So this is very dangerous. Legislation becomes order following. So there's a danger in that government functionaries, people in the government, will tend to go along with the enforcement of bad or immoral legislation when they are given those orders to do so. How strong as a government employee are you to resist complying with those things internally? Yeah. And what I'm suggesting is that I think an awful lot of people would not be able to resist it, which means we're in a really dangerous place. Yeah. So just returning to legislation for a moment, most people have a sense that legislation can be wrong. It's either badly framed or badly formed. It's impractical in some way. It's dangerous. Why? Because its scope and breadth is going to involve people who aren't actually being immoral necessarily, but it's going to catch categories of people that it probably shouldn't. There's all kinds of issues with that. And that's one of the reasons, of course, why my focus on trial by jury is so important, because effectively what that is customized justice. Yeah. But most will say that most people in society, I would say that the way to sort that problem out of bad legislation that's beginning to look a bit suspect, frankly, even to those that are actually quite asleep, how do you get rid of that legislation? And most people in society will simply say, well, you have to just vote differently in the next election. And that's what people are saying. So what does that mean when you actually think that through, when they answer that? Because let's say, for example, you're only 6 months into a political term, as we're just a little bit over that, aren't we, or something? We're not far off that now, in fact. That legislation remains authoritative, apparently, and legitimate for 4.5 years. Are we really saying that legislation that's actually quite shocking and shouldn't be there and is quite damaging and immoral, are we saying that it has legitimacy? It's absolutely correct and it's authoritative. That legislation is lawful. It has legitimacy for that long, 4.5 years more. Yeah, is that what you're saying? Are you saying that there is no other mechanism for dealing with bad or immoral law? All you've got to do is vote out a government that put it in place. Even then, you're hoping that the next administration is then going to repeal that legislation. What's the chances of that, Or you've got to beg the government in some way, in some fashion. Yeah, this is this is pretty worrying if we're down to that only, right? And there are a number of commentators out there, both in the freedom movement and in the mainstream world. So in the mainstream world, let's take, for example, black belt barrister Daniel Shensmith, who, by the way, I actually find quite interesting. I think it's a really interesting channel. And you can learn an awful lot about the justice system. And he's a very capable individual. He speaks seemingly very eloquently about the justice system. But what he does seem to do is to speak endlessly about rules, okay, about the law simply being whatever it is that government, parliament or the legislature puts onto the statute books. There doesn't seem, and I might be wrong, but it doesn't seem to be any mention at all on his channel. It seems, anyway, that there is some form of higher test for legitimacy for that legislation. So if there was an outrageous piece of legislation, seriously, and it was morally absolutely repugnant and unconscionable, well, what would you do? What would be the mechanism in place to simply withdraw your consent, if you see what I'm saying? Yeah. So when we're asking these questions, we begin to get to the nub of the problem, don't we? But that appears to be, not talked about, or at least, I don't think it has anyway. Another one is Alan Robert Shaw. And he's got a YouTube channel, and another guy who's really interesting, I think, and he says a lot of very fascinating things about the law. But again, because he's perhaps because he's a trained individual, I can't see any mention of anything higher than simply this is the legislation and it automatically holds legitimacy and authority, and then there's no mention of sort of removing your consent or how that might be done. So let's get into the subject of consent or compliance, because that's what we're really talking about, isn't it? So how do you give or withhold your consent as a member of society? Yeah. Well, firstly, you do it as an individual at the point of action or non-action. Yeah. You either do it in your your paperwork and your interaction with government, your adherence to a policy, or you do it out in the street with the police officer or the enforcer of some sort, whatever it is. And basically the subtext of that is, no, I'm not going along with that piece of legislation because, yeah, or I'm taking no notice of that legislation in this situation because, yeah, and you're standing on your moral ground there, yeah. Now, there is risk in doing that at an individual level. Yeah, that brings risk with it, definitely. But, and this is important, in a properly functioning society under a legitimate constitution, under natural justice that's functioning authentically, what would happen? That non-compliance at an individual level would be tested for legitimacy through the minds and the consciences of your social equals. Wouldn't it? Because you would then be taken before what is effectively a trial by jury, and what is trial by jury? It's a natural law tribunal. That's what it is. Yeah, and so that's being tested in that situation. And for those people who are wondering why William Keat is constantly talking about trial by jury, you need to consider why I'm thinking about that most importantly, more than anything else. And I'm going to quote something in a minute from Sir Patrick Devlin. Many of you will know and recognise that quotation in a moment, and I'll come back to it. But just to get into this, trial by jury being the nub of the issue, that there must be a process in which there is some form of affirmation or confirmation of your non-compliance, that it can be given if deemed right action. Yeah, in other words, what I'm saying there is that there is a test point that it can go to. So when you non-comply, when you refuse to comply with something, that there is a test of affirmation or confirmation that your non-compliance is in some way legitimate. Yeah, or not. In fact, it might be that because you're always going to take the risk that even when that trial by jury is in place, the jury might actually disagree with you. That's fine, and that may be the case. So there is still risk at the individual level in non-compliance and withdrawing your consent, even when juries are in place. Yeah, but with that mechanism of trial by jury in place, the risk is much less. It's easier to display your sovereignty when you know that laws are tested properly according to conscience. But with that gone, that feature, and replaced simply with summary trial, what's happening? You are risking that the state legislator or compliant magistrate will themselves find it too risky to exercise their discretion or latitude in their judgment. Yeah, so society becomes more risky when you engage in moral pushback with the absence of trial by jury. See, that's the problem, right? Now, let me just go back to that quotation then. I'm going out of order in my notes, but, why not? So this was Sir Patrick Devlin. Have a listen to this. So he's describing trial by jury and what it is and the power of the jury to judge independently of the law. Yeah, and he's saying basically that it's an insurance that the criminal law will conform to the ordinary man's idea of what is fair and just. If it does not, the jury will not be a party to its enforcement. The executive knows that in dealing with the liberty of the subject, it must not do anything which would seriously disturb the conscience of the average member of Parliament, or, this is me talking more importantly, continuing the quote, of the average juryman. I know of no other real checks that exist today upon the power of the executive. Sir Patrick Devlin, writing in 1956, that was his Hamlin Lectures, in fact. We're often quoted, yeah. But isn't that powerful? There's a member of the judiciary, of the establishment, speaking in defence of the importance of trial by jury. So many of them know this, right? Which is why it shouldn't be difficult for all of us to step up in our responsibility, to start speaking loudly and passionately about this issue. Now, this is the point is that why the current threat of further erosion of trial by jury is the most serious issue right now. Because I think that we're in a watershed moment right now. I looked up watershed moment and I looked at synonyms of that. Turning point, tipping point, defining moment. Okay, so what's happening right now is all of those things. Okay, it's not the end of the road, but it's a serious step down if this occurs as to what could occur. And I'm not seeing passion and action on the level that I think I would need to see. Yeah, nothing like. With the exception, of course, as I said, the caveats that some people who follow my work have done some brilliant stuff in writing letters with me to Brian Levison. Well done again to you guys for doing that. But it's just not enough. Yeah. So where is the attention on the issue? Because until you get the attention on the issue, you're not going to produce the moral outrage, the energy, or the passion that's required. Yeah, so this will deal with all legislative threats. At the moment, we're getting like one a week at the moment. Crazy proposals for bills of parliament that are just outrageous. We'll get on to one about banking a little bit in a little while as well. But the point is that this issue right now about trial by jury sorts out the principles of governance at the foundational level. Yeah, and if we were to sort that, and it's not something you can do by sort of like, Wednesday afternoon next week. This is going to potentially take a long time. But we've got to start now. And we could make a difference quite quickly if sufficient numbers got exercised about this. Yeah, and so we got to sort out the principles of governance, and then that threat of the sort of out of control legislature begins to weaken and eventually disappear. Yeah, and with the added benefit of moral teaching, because that's effectively what the jury does. It has a positive effect on our consciences across society as a whole. It leads to a greater sense of responsibility and trustworthiness. Yeah, and there is work that's been done, research that's been done on that. So let's get into some action, because I said that's what it was about. Yeah. So let's take Black Belt Barrister, as I said, Daniel. Okay. Interesting YouTube channel, as I said. So why don't you ask him some slightly awkward questions in a nice way, in a respectable way, okay? Such as, do you think the government could potentially do anything it likes then? It's a great question that I put out a long time ago, back in somewhere around 2018, when I spoke to the Democrats and Veterans Party. God, it feels like a lifetime ago, that one. But I started the talk with that very issue. Do you think that the government could potentially do anything it likes? Not potentially. Do you think it can do anything it likes? And sometimes I add the word legitimately on the end. Do you think it can do anything it likes? Not in a practical sense, because we know that they seem to be getting away with it. Why? Because we're kind of ignoring the fact that they're acting unlawfully, right? But the important point is, do you think that they can do anything they like legitimately? Is there a legitimacy in them doing absolutely anything they like? No, clearly not. Yeah, here's another one. Can legislation be illegitimate? Or is legislation always legitimate? Just because it's coming from government? Is it legitimate just simply because the legislature's writing it? They've got their own authority and they've got their own legitimacy built into, and their authority built into that act of writing legislation. Yeah? How do we remove our consent to immoral legislation? It's another question. It's a fair point. Give an example, perhaps, like that crazy one I gave just now. You could come up with something far better than me, I suspect. Yeah, give an example of something outrageous, and maybe give an example of something just a little bit less outrageous, but still quite worrying and quite concerning. Yeah? Would that have to be complied with? Yeah? Ask him that. Is it legitimate for the rest of the political term? So do we just have to hang around and just, for 4.5 years reckon that outrageous piece of legislation has the full authority of law and that it's absolutely legitimate? Yeah? Does it remain legitimate if the next administration also doesn't repeal it? These are important questions that they tend not to go near, I think. I've not spotted it anyway. Now, let's just look at a few organisations that over the last few days have started to... well, not started, they've been doing some quite good things for a long time, but what I'm beginning to spot is that there are some organisations out there that are doing some good things, highlighting some of the issue or part of the issue, but not linking it back to trial by jury, the Constitution, the rule of law, right? So one of them was the Free Speech Union. Now, the Free Speech Union backed a gentleman called Jamie Michael, who's a former Royal Marine, and he was tried at Merthyr Tydfil Crown Court. And the interesting thing about him is that he stuck to his guns and did not plead guilty just because of the temptation of a lighter sentence, which is what often happens. Well, if you plead guilty, then you might have a better outcome, sort of thing. Yeah, he didn't do that. He knew he was not guilty. Okay, and he opted for trial by jury. And what was interesting about it, without going into the detail, I'm not going to go into the detail because there's quite a lot of information out there about it and you should check into it. But what happened? The jury found him not guilty in 17 minutes. That's pretty swift, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. Now, why is that? That's very interesting, because perhaps it shouldn't even, the prosecution shouldn't even have been made. And I think, I believe that the CPS were requested perhaps not to, or to think about not prosecuting that case, but they went ahead anyway. Okay, so I don't know enough about the detail, and I need to look into it, but there's quite a lot of information out there, and it's very interesting. So this is interesting. So there was a man who was saved by the jury, the very mechanism that we have had in place for hundreds of years as a key feature of our rule of law. Right, it's that feature that is the primary check on immoral and therefore illegitimate prosecutions, actions of the state and legislation. Yeah, so I'm going to read you a quotation now from Lysander Spooner. Have a listen to this. The conclusion, therefore, is that any government that can for a day enforce its own laws without appealing to the people or to a tribunal fairly representing the people for their consent is in theory an absolute government, irresponsible to the people, and can perpetuate its power at pleasure. The trial by jury is based upon a recognition of this principle and therefore forbids the government to execute any of its laws by punishing violators in any case whatsoever, without first getting the consent of the country or the people through a jury. In this way, the people at all times hold their liberties in their own hands and never surrender them, even for a moment, into the hands of the government. Now that is a powerful quotation. I think you'll agree. The great lawyer, American lawyer, Lysander Spooner, and if you haven't read his essay, his 1852 essay on trial by jury, it's in the resources section on common law constitution. There's a link to a page dedicated to that essay. It's not that long, actually. You know, really everybody should read it. And if you know anybody in the legal profession, it should be compulsory reading, I think. Not that anything's compulsory, of course. We can't legislate for these things, but you know what I'm saying. Okay, so I feel that legal, all those in the legal profession should read that essay. But it's powerful stuff. Now, here's another organisation, Big Brother Watch. Okay, so generally doing some great stuff. Their key theme is surveillance, mainly through cameras, facial recognition, these kind of topics. Yeah, but just recently, what's more recently anyway has come onto the horizon is surveillance in banking, and not just surveillance either. Power of the government in the banking, in your bank accounts, basically, which is quite concerning. You'll probably have seen that, and this organisation, Big Brother Watch, has basically got a petition. Join the petition, they're saying. So that now the subtext of that then is so that we can plead to government to think again. They didn't say that. That's me saying that. Yeah, as if the only way that we can deal with this and change this path of this is to call on the legislature not to propose that bill. Right, but it's the wrong language. Yeah, what would be the right language? You can't do this. You have no moral authority to do this, and it is unconstitutional. You are acting unlawfully. You are breaching the free will and the privacy of the people in doing that. You don't have the authority to do it. That's the kind of language we should be using. Now, if it's only me doing it, and just a few around me, just a handful, but can you imagine if we had a few hundred doing it? And then a few thousand, right? We need to help organisations like Big Brother Watch come to that understanding to join the dots. It's not that they're doing some great stuff, by the way, but can you imagine how much more it would resonate with what they are trying to do if we could create an understanding around their actions that actually government doesn't have the right to do this in the first place, because there are constitutional limitations on what the government can legislate. Yeah, this is why I've been saying that more people need to gather around this message and take part in it. Yeah, it's growing, but not very fast. It's pretty small. Yeah. And remember that if we were to do this, this deals with all the situations in one go. Yeah. It's the root cause. That's the point. Yeah. Governance is the key. And similarly, back to the Free Speech Union, by the way, that helped Jamie Michael as well. There's another organisation doing some good stuff, but we could help them a bit more by infusing their language and their actions with an understanding of this. Yeah, and I could do with some help in doing that and getting to these organisations. So GB News was another one, by the way. I've been on GB News a long time ago now. I think it was about 2 years ago, actually, and I was invited on by Neil Oliver. Yeah, we touched some nerves in that one, judging by the sort of the the fallout that came out of that. It was not comfortable, actually, at the time, but it was interesting. It got people's backs up in certain places. But interestingly, GB News have been recently making some great points about trial by jury and raising the importance of trial by jury in relation to that case I was just talking about, the Jamie Michael case. Yeah. But interestingly, no connection whatsoever to the current potential threat to trial by jury through the Leveson review. Nothing at all. So educate them. Right? Get on there in the comments section. Because we or some other way communicate to them and remind them. Yeah, bring it to their attention if they've missed it. So, how do we do this? Because you can do it, obviously you can do it in comments. A lot of people get concerned because, what happens sometimes in this is that because the information that I produce is quite radical in the radical understanding of the Constitution, there are certain things that would sort of trigger immediate dismissal of that information. Okay, so maybe don't use words like Magna Carta 1215 just for the moment. I mean, it's absurd, frankly, that we actually have to do that. But maybe leave that out. And maybe don't even use the word Constitution if it's going to cause problems. Just test the water, right? But instead, use language like rule of law. Use phrases like government is a servant of the people. Use the term public servants or oaths of office. This is all, glimpses, if you like, into the fact that there is a constitution. All of these things are components, if you like, of the rule of law. Oaths of office, as I said. Answerable to us. That concept. Accountability. Scrutiny. Yeah, the Nolan principles, all that sort of stuff. The Peel's 9 principles of policing. All of these are little glimpses into the fact that we have a constitutional rule of law. But by using that kind of language, maybe you don't have to use the trigger words that sort of bring about instant dismissal. Yeah, so there are lots of ways of doing it. So law is supposed to be used with discretion and the exercise of conscience. Because if it isn't, then what are you doing? You're order following. The people are following orders in the legislation, which is basically what becomes orders, essentially. And it's just compliance. And the people in the system are following orders as well in the enforcement of that as well. So use these arguments and phrases. Yeah, justice is not just about following orders. It's about morality and conscience. Yeah, doing what you are told is not virtuous. Virtue actually lies in the exercise of your moral compass, doesn't it? There's no virtue in just doing what you're told. That's not it. Yeah, and the wonderful thing is that that's what people are doing on the jury. Yeah, that's the exercising of your conscience. And it's establishing it as a key point or a key principle within our law. So help people in officialdom, institutions, organisations, whether it's government itself or other organisations, come to that understanding. Help them make the connections. Yeah, it's not all about suffrage and voting in elections, because that doesn't bring about consent. That is not the check or the mechanism on government. Okay, now I'm just going to quote Spooner just to finish off. Again, have a listen to this. This is what he has to say about adult suffrage, which is what the voting in elections concept is. The whole majority, party politics, all of that kind of stuff. That's what is generally termed adult suffrage. Yeah, we've been told to think that that's what democracy is, and I don't think it is, actually. I think democracy is the inclusion of the principle of trial by jury, in fact. Yeah, I think we've been led to believe that democracy is actually all about adult suffrage. I don't think that's the case. So have a listen to this. This is Spooner again. Suffrage is equally powerless and unreliable. It can be exercised only periodically, and the tyranny must at least be borne until the time for suffrage comes. Besides, when the suffrage is exercised, it gives no guarantee for the repeal of existing laws that are oppressive, and no security against the enactment of new ones that are equally so. The right of suffrage, therefore, and even a change of legislators, guarantees no change of legislation. So, I'll make sure that quotation is in my... there's a page in the resources section of Common Law Constitution, and I don't think that quotation is in there. There's a page dedicated to sort of useful quotations in support of trial by jury and the Constitution, and I'll make sure that one's in there. And maybe use that and others, and just paste that into comments on the various organisation websites, but just do it politely, do it nicely and respectfully, but get people thinking, yeah? But there it is. I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you found that useful and interesting. Cheers for now.